Last Thursday, we got some of the biggest news in Taiwan-China-US relations in, a decade. It turns out that the United States has had troops on Taiwan for over a year, meaning Trump put them there. Now, this is crazy because for the past year, we've been hearing about how aggressive China is being over Taiwan. They're doing all these things that are supposedly so mean and crazy, but you have to realize that China would have known that Trump had put troops there as soon as Trump had put troops there. They've known about this for a year, so that means all the news we've heard in the United States has been nonsense. Like, China hasn't been super aggressive considering what a big deal it is that U.S. troops are on Taiwan now. They've actually been pretty restrained. The deals that were made between the United States and China in the 1970s after these two guys met, Nixon and Mao, are really complicated. They've been changed. They've been renegotiated. A lot of it's just unilateral U.S. stuff. But anybody, anybody who's at all honest, has to concede that putting U.S. troops on Taiwan is an extraordinarily aggressive move that we took a year ago. So it's the United States that is the aggressor here, which is huge, huge news. We learned this on Thursday, but on Saturday, the New York Times published a big summing up article about U.S.-China relations over Taiwan. And do you know where they mentioned? Do you know where they mentioned this, huge blockbuster news? In paragraph 49, with a single sentence. This is important to emphasize because this is how U.S. media bias works. They don't completely ignore the relevant information. They just tell it to you once, and then they never mention it again. Back in 2018, the United States military slaughtered a bunch of Russian fighters in the desert in Syria, and it was mentioned, it was reported on, and then never ever mentioned again. Because these stories like this, about the fact that the U.S. is the obvious aggressor in Taiwan, get ignored because they're not just bad for the U.S. military defense contractor sell weapons narrative, they're also bad for the Russian and Chinese nationalist narratives too. The world is a lot safer than we think, and it's mostly the U.S. causing these problems. But we don't want anybody to know that. Not even the Russians or the Chinese want you to know that. It's really kind of sad. Hey, I still can't get over this insane news from last Thursday, October 7th. The United States has troops on Taiwan and has had them there for over a year. The U.S. government's explanation seems to be basically time travel, and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, other outlets seem to be accepting this time travel explanation. They're saying that the U.S. putting troops on Taiwan is justified by the aggressive things that China has done because the U.S. has troops on Taiwan. Does that strike anybody else as a little crazy? Another thing U.S. outlets are doing is completely downplaying how important this move is. Nixon went to China, but it was actually this guy, Jimmy Carter, that regularized relations with China that allowed everything that has come since to be built up. And one of the fundamental understandings here was that the United States would actually break its self-defense treaty with Taiwan and withdraw its military forces. That is fundamental to the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and we just learned that the U.S. binned that over a year ago. This is huge. So obviously this revises everything we thought we knew about U.S.-China-Taiwan relations over the past year. All of these violations of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, not its airspace by the way, but all of these violations over the past year, everything that Xi Jinping has said, all this big aggression towards Taiwan is actually self-defense, and honestly kind of meager self-defense. But I wonder if we can go even further than that. You see, the U.S. government sources that the Wall Street Journal was able to get on record were pretty vague about what was going on here. We've been there for at least a year. So what does that mean? When did U.S. troops get there? That's a very important question. I think it has relevance beyond Taiwan to Hong Kong as well. In June of 2020, the Chinese government opted to end the whole idea of one China, two systems a full quarter century earlier than it had agreed to. They decided to essentially crush Hong Kong self-determination starting in June of 2020. So were there U.S. troops on Taiwan at that point? Let me be clear, this is a really dumb move by the Chinese government regardless, and I think a miscalculation regardless, but if they were responding to Trump's installation of U.S. troops in Taiwan, then it becomes a lot more understandable. Is it really China that has been the aggressive actor here at all? Hello and welcome to another edition of What If the United States Had a Foreign Policy, which I explain some of the extraordinary opportunities that the United States could take advantage of if anybody in Washington, D.C. had half a fucking brain. Today we're talking Afghanistan. Well, the U.S. empire has certainly been humiliated there recently. We withdrew our troops and the country almost immediately broke out into a greater peace than it has experienced in 40 years. Washington, D.C., they're running around with their heads cut off. They're trying to figure out how to bring war back to the country and ignoring an extraordinary opportunity that's in front of them. That opportunity is actually the Taliban. Now, the British Empire also got humiliated in Afghanistan multiple times in the 1800s until they figured something out after the second time they were humiliated and almost chased out of the country. What they did was they decided to start bribing the guys who beat them. It worked. It worked incredibly well. The British retained control of Afghanistan's foreign policy at dramatically lower cost than losing all that military men and material, and controlled the place pretty much up until the British screwed themselves by jumping into World War I. The Taliban traditionally has a terrible relationship with Iran. The Taliban's predecessors fought a massive war against the Russians. The Taliban could probably be convinced to have bad relations with the extraordinarily anti-Islam Chinese. Now, folks in D.C. are understandably a little angry at Pakistan for what they've done to us, completely supporting the Taliban throughout this 20-year war. But you know what we have more than Pakistan does? Money. You know what Pakistan liked about the Taliban? That it was kind of weak, easy to control militia force. You know what Pakistan wouldn't like? A Taliban that's completely in control of Afghanistan and a client of the United States. You gotta turn a problem into a victory. Worried about Afghan women? Me too. That would be the price of our support of the Taliban. They were already interested in not taking Kabul and sort of preserving that as a healthy window on the world. And really, it was only Kabul and a few other cities that provided any rights to women while we were there anyway. The Taliban is ready to make this deal. They are eager to make this deal, especially now as the economy is collapsing as we are withdrawing all our aid money. The Taliban wants to make this deal. Does Washington, D.C.? Of course not. They'd prefer to keep a civil war going. You know, the kind of thing that a middle power like Pakistan or Iran can deal with infinitely better than we can. We already have all the funding relationships set up. By working with the Taliban, we could help the Afghan people, we could help Afghan women, we could set up an actually powerful and useful client in the midst of a whole bunch of countries we consider our rivals for cheap. Will we do it? No, of course not.